We are bringing in Greg Sankey. He is the commissioner of the SEC. And by the way, I would encourage everybody out there to go listen to our long-form conversation that we had this past summer about how you end up being the commissioner of a conference. And by the way, Greg, I know you never would have hoped this, but I tweeted out that you were joining. And I usually don't go into my mentions, but I happened to do it. And the very first response is, ask him how the SEC can have such absolutely terrible officiating. And I want to say this right off the top. You probably never would have believed that you would long for the days when you got to go on and talk about officiating errors as opposed to coming on to talk about pandemics.
I've observed that I long for the days of those complaints because that means we're doing what we do and compete. I will note for that insightful user of social media, we have a transition in our football officiating leadership and in our men's basketball officiating leadership. So part of that's working to get better, which we do every day.
All right. Greg Sankey, you can follow him on Twitter at Greg Sankey. And I can't even imagine what your mentions have been like as this process played itself out since, honestly, you were in Nashville and pulled players off the basketball court effectively in the middle of the SEC basketball tournament. And ever since then, it's been a situation where you don't really know from one moment to the next what to expect. So I want to start with this question for you. Right now, so far, I believe you have 2 out-of-conference games that have been impacted by decisions made by the Big Ten. There were no games between the SEC and the Big Ten, but then by Southern Cal and Colorado as a part of the Big 12. The Pac-12 decision not to play only conference games. Alabama was going to play SC, and I think A&M was going to play Colorado. Do you expect for those 2 schools to replace those opponents? Are they working on that right now?
The expectation, I'm always careful about that word in this environment, which you can imagine, but the opportunities will be there. We're not alone in having lost non-conference games because of other conference decisions. And so all of these other football programs that have lost opportunities are now looking for games as well. So the good news is, even though we've had those 2 that have slipped away, there will be opportunities for both Alabama and A&M to find other opponents should they move down that pathway.
Do you think they will announce that as replacing opponents, or is that something that wouldn't be announced until into August? And the reason why I ask is, obviously, Alabama-USC was going to be a huge game that was taking place, I believe, in Dallas at a neutral site. But there are now a lot of teams that are desperate to replace the non-conference games that they may have had scheduled against the Pac-12 and against the Big Ten. So if Alabama wanted to add a team potentially to come to Tuscaloosa and play them, there's a market out there of a lot of teams that would want to get that game, I would imagine. And the same thing is true for Texas A&M in the wake of their game against Colorado being canceled.
Yeah, that's true. And I'll be honest, I've visited with both athletics directors on several occasions. In fact, we had an in-person meeting all day Monday for the first time since March. And so we've talked about the interest and opportunities. I've not, Clay, asked them, when will you make this decision and when might that be announced? So the honest, direct answer is I don't know when they'll make the decision and I don't know when they'll announce, but I'm certain if they do make that additional game happen, that we'll hear about it in the right time frame.
What was it like to actually get to meet all of your athletic directors in person?
It was nice. I reminded them that when we had last met, it was on a Wednesday in Nashville, and we had provided them with a press release that essentially said, for fans not comfortable attending, we'll just give you your money back, no questions asked, at our basketball tournament. And they weren't quite ready on that Wednesday morning to say that's the right way to go. And the idea was kind of like voluntary social distancing. If you're not comfortable attending, then we'll work with you to make it right. And then that day just spun in a whole different direction. So by about 3 o'clock, like that press release was in the background and we were in a whole different world. And so I reminded them of that, which is a really good illustration of how information has changed so quickly and even within a particular day. And lot of space between people, a lot of face mask coverings and hand sanitizer around, but really good conversation. I think we're all a little bit tired of Zoom, and so to be in a room and have people talk over each other a little bit is really a healthy thing.
What can you tell me about testing numbers for SEC athletes? It seems like a lot of times we only hear negatives, right? LSU seemed to have an issue. Certainly we've heard about Ohio State, or we've heard about Clemson, different places that have had to shut down as a result. How are the numbers looking at the SEC among your athletes now that most of them, I believe, have been back on campus for over a month now?
Yeah, so just a few elements. One, testing happened at most places upon return, and then most others, in fact, I think all others, shortly thereafter. And part of that is the testing decisions, availability, turnaround. And our universities have not, in a majority, released all their numbers. So you can understand I'm not going to do that. But it's important that people understand the numbers. We brought people back and had positive tests among our student athletes. They had care, they had oversight, they had the kind of support. And then we had young people that had to go through the learning experience that college today and moving forward this fall doesn't appear that it will be like college when you were at George Washington, right? You know, the gatherings and the way you interact have impact. So you had a lot of isolations, not positive tests, but isolations. And now, when I'm done here, we'll jump on a call with our medical group. Last week, our numbers are way down in the low single digits to zero. One of my presidents this week said, hey, I'm comfortable that we can support and oversee and keep people healthy. And part of what's had to happen is the education about how you conduct yourself on your own time.
Have juniors and seniors on teams had to kind of corral the freshmen and sophomores and say, hey, knuckleheads, if we want to have a season, you guys got to stay out of parties, you got to stay out of bars, you got to do things different than maybe, like you just mentioned, a typical college kid might have done it when you or I or a lot of the people listening to us might have been college kids?
A couple answers to that. I asked that question after one of those, sources say this number had this issue or this number of isolations, and I just asked who it was, and before I allowed the answer, I said, are the juniors and seniors who are ready to play, ready to have this opportunity, educating young people. So it's not a broad brush. I think generally there is some truth to that the wisdom of a few years of age has indeed been helpful. And everyone's had to adjust. And, you come back and you're back home, and that's the word that I've heard used by student athletes. You're back home on campus, and you have to think in a different way. We've all had that. Even at our AD meeting, you realize, wow, the first time in a meeting room, we're going to have to function a bit differently than we would have 6 months ago.
You said, I know you don't want to get into specifics, but you said potentially single-digit positive cases across the SEC, meaning at least on your campuses, the numbers are moving in a positive direction among student athletes as opposed to in a negative direction.
Yeah, that's correct. And down to zero. And our programs are, obligated to report locally and through their health officials, and they do that appropriately. And there has been a learning. In fact, that comment has been there repeatedly, and part of what I expect will happen upon return to campus is a lot more information spread even more broadly about behavioral changes that have to take place because of the virus that is around us.
Do you think that your athletes are safer on campus than they would be if they were at home in wherever they live right now?
So that's one of those judgment conversations that we spent a lot of time on in April and May. In fact, Clay, when we shut down back in March, it's because there were so many unknowns. And then we had to think about what that meant for young people. We disrupted the foundation of their lives, their rhythm, their opportunities. We continued with support to the extent that was possible from a distance. And then as we headed back to May, we took time, rather than bring them back June 1st, brought them back June 8th. But part of the reality was we had gyms opening up all around the country. And I was on a Zoom call with a student athlete who had gone to two different gyms on the same day for two different workouts. He's a smart guy, but you don't know the gym, you don't know who's overseeing that, you don't know the hygiene policies of that facility. In our athletic programs, you have embedded medical professionals that do this on a daily basis. They look out for the health and well-being of our young people. They all had hygiene and sanitization plans. They work in the small groups. They follow every one of the guidelines that you could imagine. They have long policies, and it has worked well to date. And they've met the expectations of managing themselves, and it's been a bit of a learning experience for everyone, but it has gone, by all accounts, shared with me in the way we had hoped.
All right, I'm going to hit you with a couple of facts that are going on in the larger community of sports. Major League Baseball is coming back next week. The NBA and the NHL are coming back the week after. I believe today in the state of Tennessee, there are going to be potentially 30,000 fans watching an event in Bristol. MLB, NHL, NBA, MLS, PGA, WNBA, UFC, NWSL, the PBA, boxing, NASCAR, and the NFL are all planning to be back in some form or fashion by August 1st if they haven't already returned. If all of those sports can play, why can't college football?
Well, that's a question, and it actually informs the message that I've communicated repeatedly, that I think we need to be patient in our decision-making, and we will. In fact, back in April, a biostatistician with whom I visited said, look, if you can wait as long as possible to make major decisions, you're going to have better information. And Clay, I actually have a list of probably not all of those events, but the Bristol event tonight, I think, is an important step. Major League Baseball, who will move people around. They're not in a bubble. They're going to move their umpires around. That's an important, really, set of information for us. And we've visited with people from those leagues, and we'll continue to do so. The start of NFL training camp is an important opportunity for us to view football practice taking place, and we've got time before our practices are scheduled to adjust. So all of that's important information that will inform the decision, and the ability to answer the question of why can't, that's out there. But our programs are on campuses. They're high density areas, and so the ability to manage that full environment is really important. Travel is going to be much different. And we don't just have one team. So the luxury of baseball and football at the professional level and soccer is they have one sport, one set of athletes. We have between 20 and 25 sports and hundreds of young people involved. And we want to make sure that we're able to do this safely. And I don't know what will happen this fall yet. I've been vocal. We need to see some positive news and continue to see positive news and hopefully see that rapidly.
You talk about late July. When do schools have to, in terms of making decisions about, say, football, when do schools have to notify their students about whether students will be back on campus? And what date, I'm sure you've got this on your calendar in some way, what date is the first day that students would be returning to Southeastern Conference schools?
Students have been returning all spring. Again, you go back to college experiences, and that's a place where people wanted to be. Now, they may not have been in classes, but they've been either on or around campus. We have some in-person classes taking place during the summer. When you look to the fall semester, first day of classes is August 17th among all of our schools. So we have a range from last check, which was Friday, August 17th, through the 31st of first day of classes. And you probably heard a lot of kind of a compressed fall schedule, ability to adapt and being ready to adapt based on what happens from a health standpoint. But students will come back well before that first day of classes. There may be social opportunities, fraternity, sorority. There's a preparation, move-in. The move-in dates may have been spread longer. So that activity will begin in late July, early August relative to students returning.
Could you play with, let's say that they do like, hey, we're going to do online learning for the first month, right? Like, who knows? Because every different local school district is making different decisions. Could you play sports, football in particular, without students on campus?
Well, students are going to be on and around campus, it appears, no matter what. That's just reality. What I have observed is our universities have to be back in operation, and the debate would be, well, what form does that take, and when is it appropriate to continue playing athletics? Because there may be other decisions associated with expanded distance learning. If you roll the tape back, what I've never said is, all the students have to be back on campus. Others have made that observation. I think it's a bit overly broad, and that's probably been acknowledged because, the fall semester, in fact, higher education moving forward, I expect will look different than it did even last year or certainly 10 or 20 years ago. It's just a different world for a number of reasons. The virus has accelerated some of this transition and change.
Do all 5 conferences need to have the same decision made about returning for college football? Or, for instance, right now, the Big Ten and the Pac-12 have said, hey, we're not playing non-conference. The ACC and the Big 12 and the SEC, of which you're the commissioner, have made decisions that they're going to wait longer. Could it be a situation where one conference plays and one conference does not? One conference plays all games, another conference doesn't? How much unanimity of final decision do we need across the 5 conferences?
I don't envision a total hodgepodge. So there are 3 of us who've been in the last week communicating it for obvious reasons about the importance of patience in our decision making. And right now I could envision different directions. And that's part of waiting. That doesn't mean, Clay, it will happen. I've said with some frequency, if you look back to March, we all made independent decisions and ended at the same destination relative to our basketball tournament stopping. Now, there are a lot of factors for that, but let's go back to where we started this conversation. We've lost 2 games, so the bulk of our non-conference games were with Big 12 and ACC members, others in the FBS, and those games are still intact. So it's an indication that we could do something different than others, but there would be a need to have, in my view, some participation of other conferences to not all be in the same conference-only setting.
You've got big rival games: South Carolina, Clemson, Louisville, Kentucky, Florida State, Florida, Georgia, Georgia Tech. In particular, with the with the ACC. These are games that all college football fans love. They're in-state rivalry games. They also are pretty much all reachable by bus. Have you had particular conversations with the ACC about those games and a desire to preserve them, even if there might be non-conference changes otherwise?
Sure. At the end of last week, in fact, we have regular calls, but on one of those calls with my colleagues, I observed those games. I don't know why it's better or worse. I guess one could take their own side of an evaluation for Georgia Tech to be on a bus and go up to Athens. It's a non-conference game, but it seems one that could happen, and you could play that out through other circumstances of games that have been canceled. But for us, there are a set of proximal games. There's also games between our conference institutions that are a bit further, but we are going to have and have been working for weeks and months with our medical teams to have common testing protocol, common oversight, common reporting, common isolation, so that we can have healthy competition among non-conference teams. We're going to keep pursuing that with the idea that those games are important. Now, from a scheduling standpoint, depending on what happens, Clay, I don't know what happens with the ability and the flexibility within a schedule and the time that we may need to play those games and still determine a conference champion. And I think what you saw out of some others is the heavy emphasis on creating space in their schedule so they could play conference games and determine a conference champion. We're not at that point, but that we have to be attentive to what realities may develop and guide our decision making.
Last question for you. Have you guys designed potential changes in the schedule? Do you have an 8-team? Do you have a 10-team? You obviously have a 12-team schedule. Are there externalities that you're preparing for in the event you have to adjust?
Yeah, let me just change one word because you were asking about teams. So I'm going to put it at games. So 8-game,
yeah, sorry.
10-game. Yeah. So, an odd number of conference games doesn't make a lot of sense, because then, in addition to debating whether you change your schedule, you're debating who gets the extra home game, right? You with me?
Yes.
On that one? And so you're going to be at an even number if you have to go to that. And we've been working on those scenarios and date scenarios for a long, long time. So, I saw a note that, there's no plan. Well, there's been a plan in development ever since March. We've been working on what's next. The reality is the circumstances around us change so rapidly that we're constantly having to adapt our plans and imagine and consider what else might be out there for us.
I might have bungled that a little bit, but so there's a possibility that you could play, let's say, a 10-game SEC-only schedule if necessary.
Well, you've seen the CFP debate, so I'm not going to give that one away, but we'll be prepared in certain directions. That would be included if we needed to. And when I corrected, you never correct the host, but I didn't want people to think we're going to be removing teams from the conference.
Yeah, that would be a hell of a headline. I know I said last question, but you talked over the weekend and said your nervousness level about whether or not the season would be played was high to very high. After meeting with your athletic directors, talking to school presidents and whatnot in the last several days, how would you assess your current read on the situation for college football, SEC in particular, being played this fall?
Yeah, I'm gonna again correct the host. I used the word concern, so I'm trying not to be nervous in life, but there is concern, and we're dealing with an uncertainty. And one of the first things I said to the ADs is there's a really good book called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke that just says, poker's a really good example of a game where you have to make decisions with incomplete information, and you make the best judgments possible. And we're in a situation where we have incomplete information, and the information you have doesn't tend to say people are paying attention and that we're having the right kind of trends. And you know what? I mean, you've been a part of it, right? It's all debatable. It's all changing. You're trying to figure out how to access and evaluate information. So in the environment we're in, yeah, that concern still exists. I'm really pleased with both our presidents and chancellors group, and I visited individually with each one over the weekend just to find out what they're thinking, what their direction is, what's happening on campus. And then with our ADs on Monday, committed to patience. It's like a baseball analogy where we've been throwing a curveball. We didn't make great contact. It's a ground ball, but we still need to run it out and see what happens. And so we're going to run this one out and see what happens. But health and safety of our participants, our student athletes, our coaches, those around the game are going to be at the forefront of our thinking.
I appreciate the time. I know how many different things you have going on right now. I apologize for bungling the past two questions. I'm glad you corrected me on it. If everybody gets mad at you, maybe you can be a sports talk radio host one day.
Well, that may be. I hear you have 5 jobs open, right? So maybe.
We do have 5 jobs open at OUTKICK, so you can go put your resume in.
There you go.
Good stuff as always. That's SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey.